rounding, something you've been doing again since elementary school. Today we're going to talk about it with decimals and maybe give you a little bit more insight about what rounding really is and what its purpose is. Rounding is a method used to make numbers easier to calculate or understand. If numbers have zeros on the end of them, typically they're easier to understand. They're easier to add or subtract or multiply in our heads. It's easier to do mental math with numbers that we've rounded, and sometimes an approximate answer is good enough. And so rounding can happen to the nearest 10 or 100 or 1,000 or tenth or the nearest whole number. It's always used with the word nearest, and the reason why is because every single number is between two different numbers, a set of numbers. And when you're rounding, you're finding the one that it is closest to or nearest to. And the directions, when you're rounding, tell you what place value they want you to look at. So if I were going to round this number, I might round it to the nearest whole number. 3.4 is between 3 and 4. 3.4 is closer to 3. 19 is between 10 and 20. And because it's closer to 20, rounded to the nearest 10 would indeed be 20. 576. Well, this number is between 500 and 600, but it's also between 570 and 580. So we could round this number to the nearest 100, or we could round it to the nearest 10. Depends on what the directions tell us, or if it's for our purpose. If we round it to the nearest 10, we're going to get a closer estimated answer to what it actually is. If we round it to the nearest 100, we'll still get an answer, but it won't be as close. And our last example here is 1.97. It's between 1 and 2, or between 1.9 and 2. Either way, it rounds to 2. So, let's take this and see how it affects us in math class with numbers we'd see every day. Round these numbers to the nearest 10. We have a 97 and we have a 43. When I think about rounding, I think about number lines, and I think about finding the two that are between. And so this number line is counting by tens because these directions said round to the nearest 10. So I have to first find out where 97 would go on my number line. Now, because these are counting by tens, I have to remember that in between each set of numbers there is between 70 and 80. There's a 71 and a 72 and a 73 and a 74 and a 75 and a 76 and a 77 and a 78 and a 79. And so if this per se maybe rounding mountain you've heard before is between each number, then it helps us know which one it's closest to. Or we could remember that the halfway point between each of these is going to be a 5. So this would be 95. And because 97 is bigger, we put it here, and therefore rounding it to the nearest 10 means that this rounds to 100. So maybe you think about the rounding mountain. Maybe you know that 4 and under round back, or 5 and up round to the next one. 43 would come before the halfway point of 45, which means that it would round to 40. Those numbers are rounded to the nearest 10. Now let's round to the nearest hundredth. We have our number line here that's counting by hundredths, which means it's counting by pennies. And this is very often one used when you're dealing with prices. When you're finding unit prices, you want to round to the nearest penny. So if I round to the nearest hundredth, I identify the hundredths place, which if you'll remember our trick from our last lesson, hundredths means that I could put a 1 in the ones place until I've made the number 100. And so this 5 is what we could say is the digit that is either going to stay or go up. This is what we're going to find on our number line, 3.05. And so 3.05, 9. Well, halfway between 3.05 and 3.06 is 3.055. So this must be closer to 3.06. This, when you are dealing with whole numbers, you can turn into a 0, but because we're dealing with decimals, 3.06 is equivalent to 3.060. So either answer is correct. This is the better answer, because when it says round to the nearest hundredth, I should be able to read the number that I wrote and say hundredth in my answer. 3 6 hundredths. If I left it there, that says 3 60 thousandths. Is it equivalent to 3 6 hundredths? It is. But this is your better answer. 3 172 thousandths rounded to the nearest hundredth. Identify the hundredths place, which some teachers have called this a rocket. And if you can count down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, your rocket takes off. Our rocket is not going to take off because it's only a 2. It's not 5 or higher. So this becomes a 0, and our rocket number stays a 7. Let's try some more examples. Rounding to the nearest whole. This is a whole number in front of the decimal. So when I round to the nearest whole, I identify the whole. Every number in front of the decimal. And then we're going to decide if this number is closest to 13 or the next whole, which would be 14. So rounding to the nearest whole would be the same as rounding to the nearest ones. This rounds to 14 because here's my rocket. The 7 has told it to go up, and these have turned to zeros. 4,567,857 and 35 hundredths. Rounded to the nearest whole. There's my rocket. The 3 doesn't tell it to blast off. The 3 isn't enough to send it on its way. So the answer is 4,567,857. Notice that we're rounding to the nearest whole number, which means we don't have decimals in our answer. Is it wrong to put a decimal here? No, but it's an understood decimal. We know that it's there, so there's no need to write it. 9,652 and 39 hundredths rounded to the nearest whole would be 9,652 because the 2 is in the ones place and the 3 is not enough to send it on its way. So those become zeros. 88.95. Rounding it to the nearest whole means putting this in the rocket and looking at the 9 telling it to yes, go up. So 89 is the answer here. So push pause and see how you do with these. Alright, we have 5 questions here. We're going to round to the nearest and whatever word was in front of it. So round to the nearest whole means I'm going to underline the whole number. The 6 is here. The 7 says round up, so the nearest whole is 357. Round this to the nearest tenth is identify the tenths place, Look at the digit to the right of it. It rounds to 4 6/10. I've done this correctly because the last word that I say is the word that I'm rounding it to. Round to the nearest hundredth is the 9 because it is 2 digits after the ones place, after the decimal. And the 3 just tells it not to round up, so we're going to say 13 59/100ths. This one says round to the nearest thousand. And the 4 says stay the same, so we're going to round it to 9,000. And then finally, round this to the greatest place value. The greatest place value is the 10,000s place. And because it is followed by a 9, we would round this to 20,000.